Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to use Regex to perform some pattern matching in Rust. So let's start by creating a new project with the cargo command. So cargo new regex example. Let's change directory into this regex example and open this with our editor. Okay, so here there's the usual setup for Rust project. Here we have the TOML file where we're gonna add the dependencies, and here we have the main.rs file where we're gonna write our code. So let's start by adding a couple of dependencies to our TOML file. Here we have the lazy static dependency, which is some helper functionality that allow us to instantiate structure, new instances of regex structures at that usually happen at runtime, but because we want to create some static regex instances, this macro helps us to do that. We're gonna see this in a moment, so bear with me. So let's open a terminal and type cargo build so we can download the code for these dependencies and cache this for later. Okay, so let's talk about some context first. So the library we're going to use is this library. Here you have some documentation about how this library works. And we're going to use the RE2 standard for regex. And this is the standard used by the Go programming language. And here you can read about it and you can have more information. This is a very useful website that allows us to test our regex and try to see if we're able to match some strings and extract information from these strings. Okay, so let's start by importing some modules. And also let's start defining some regex and talk a bit about what we're trying to do. Okay, so this is our lazy static macro at work. Here you can have some more, you can read about it in a bit more details. Let's say we are building our backend API and we need to provide some routes for the HTTP URLs. So for example, let's pretend we want to create some work and we have our host and /work route, and then we want to retrieve some existing resources. So we have our /work123. So we pretend we want to retrieve the resource 123. So our router needs to extract this 123 identifier to be able to retrieve the resource from an hypothetical database in the backend. And let's say, for example, we want to search for existing work, and so we provide query parameters in our URL, and our router needs to be able to extract this ID from the query parameters. And here you can see the regex at work. One tiny detail to keep in mind is that here you can see we are escaping the backslash with another backslash, but this is just because of how the Rust language works. It's not part of the regex, and in fact that's why I pasted here the original regex. So we mentioned this website. So let's say we can go there and test our regex so we can see how this is useful. Okay, so this is the website. On the left panel, you can see that you can choose different flavors for regex. And we know we're using the Golang regex, so the RE2 standard. So here we can paste our regex that is supposed to recognize paths and information, extract information from URL paths. Here on the right side, you can see some explanation on how this regex is built. So let's see if this works. We insert some text here, and as you can see, we are able to match 1, 2, 3 from this string. So we are able to extract this information to later on process that somewhere else. Let's go on with another example, a bit more complicated, just to see how this stuff works. Again, here on the right side, you have some explanation on why this regex works. And let's test the regex. So, okay, so here you can see that we are able to recognize key value pairs and extract information like this identifier. All right, we're gonna use this regex in our project, so let's go back to the code. Okay, so let's summarize what we're going to do in our program. So we want to create we want to run a simple match on a very simple regex, which is this one that is supposed to recognize URL paths like /work, /work, /. And then we want to match more complicated regex to extract path parameters from URLs. So, for example, this retrieve work regex that is supposed to match this kind of paths or this kind of URL paths and extract this identifier from the path. And then, as a final example, we want to extract information from query parameters of URL paths, of URLs. And so we use this search work regex that is supposed to recognize URLs like this and recognize key value pairs as query parameters and extract this information from the string. Right, so let's start with the first example. So the very simple basic regex. Here you can see we have two paths, two very simple URLs, /work, /work, / and in both cases they should be able to trigger this regex. So here we defined a regex with regex new, which is a function provided by the regex dependency that is returning a result. So we are unwrapping it and basically getting back a regex instance that we can later on use to match strings. So this is a regex instance, as you can see here, of type regex. And in here, we are using the isMatch method applied to the regex type instance to see if the string we are providing as a input parameter is matching the regex. Okay, so let's see if this works by invoking our program with cargo run. Okay, so we are done with simple URL matches. And because we are using the assert macro here, this means that this resolves to true. So there is a match for these strings, and there's no error with the regex. A quick way of testing this would be, for example, to negate the Boolean expression, and so you can see that now this is going to fail, right? So there's a panic because this is resolving to false, and that means we are making the assertion fail. But actually the expected behavior is that this regex is gonna match these strings, so we are good like this. Okay, so the next example is about matching path parameters inside strings and extract information. Okay, so as an input here we have an array of 2 strings that represent URL paths, and what we want to do is extract this ID information for later on processing it somewhere in our backend API. So in this for loop, we are first of all asserting that there's a match between each of these strings and the retrieve work regex, and this is the way we defined this regex. So the next thing we're going to do is proceed with extracting this information from the path. And the way we do this is a bit convoluted, but let's go through this so we make sure we know what we're doing. So the retrieve work regex, which is an instance of a structure of type regex coming from our dependency. We want to capture the information from the input string. This returns an option, and then we process this with the and then function, and then we provide a closure here. So a closure is something that is familiar to many different programming languages. You may be familiar with this kind of syntax from other languages, but basically we pretend that this capture provide something called ID underscore cap, which is basically representing this information that we capture from the regex matching the string, and then we name it as ID, and then we map the ID as a string, and then we parse this string outside the closure to be an I32 type. So eventually we're gonna have a variable of type I32 representing this information and this information from the input strings that have been matched by the regex. And then we're going to use the print line macro to print the URL, the original, let's say, input string, and the information that we extracted from this string. So let's go ahead and run this to see if it works. All right, as you can see here, we are parsing this input string and extracting the correct information as a integer type 32. And then we're providing this input string and again parsing our I32 type variable, extracting the correct information. Okay, our final example is about URL query parameters. So let's take this piece of code, and what we're going to do is process an array of 3 elements. Each string is supposed to be a URL providing query parameters after this question mark of the URL. So here you see the key and the value, and we want to extract 1, 2, 3, foo, and foo1 bar2 buzz3. So this is basically a way of saying, okay, we want to extract numbers, characters, strings with alphabetic characters, but also a mix of alphabetic characters and numbers, digits. So what we're going to do is, first of all, use the assert macro to assert that the search work regex instance is matching our current URL's string coming from our array. So we are looping on all the elements of this array. And then we are using again, in a similar way as we did before, the captures method to parse the input string and retrieve the information that is defined in this regex, as you can see here in the definition of the regex. And then there's another closure that is taking the output coming from this functionality and extracting as a string basically this 1, 2, 3, this foo, and this foo1 bar2 buzz3. We unwrap this information, and because we want to both parse alphabetic characters and numbers, this word code that we extracted from these strings is gonna be a pointer to an str type. So basically we're not actually here parsing to i32 as we were doing before. Then, as a final step, after asserting that the search work regex is matching, after extracting the information from our input strings into another string, we can use the printline macro to print the original string that was processed by the regex and the information we extracted from the regex. So let's go ahead and run this to see if it works. Okay, and as you can see here at the bottom, we are able to parse input strings with query parameters of URLs, and correctly we are parsing 1, 2, 3 coming from this query parameter, foo coming from this query parameter, and foo1 bar2 buzz3 coming from this query parameter. And that's it for today. Happy Rust coding to everyone, and I'll catch you on the next one.